Hello and welcome to Volunteering SA&NT's Commonwealth Home Support Program Volunteer Podcast Series. My name is David and I'll be hosting today's discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're recording today from the land of the Kaurna people, who are the traditional owners and custodians of the Adelaide Plains. I pay my respects to their deep and withstanding connection to the land, waters and community, which remains as significant today as it has been for thousands of years. I extend that respect to elders past, present and emerging, and to any First Nations people who may be listening today. This podcast is part of Volunteering SA&NT's Sector Support and Development for the Commonwealth Home Support Program, or CHSP as we like to call it. We hope that volunteer managers and coordinators working within CHSP programs will find some useful tips and insights to take into their own work. I will also point out that although funding for this presentation has been provided by the Australian Government, the material contained herein does not necessarily represent the views or policies of the Australian Government. Today we're going to be chatting about advertising volunteer roles on web-based platforms and what are the key elements to keep in mind as a volunteer coordinator. It's really important to get this right so that as a provider you can attract suitable volunteers to your organisation. I'm joined today by Roxane Foulser-Piggott, CEO of Freddy Match. Roxane's volunteering journey began as a teenager, doing gardening work in an aged care home. She continued to volunteer throughout her undergraduate and doctoral studies in engineering, helping STEM education in local schools, and designing databases for a charity supporting the families of prisoners. During her career in consulting and finance, Roxane was an independent monitor in a maximum security prison in the UK. Following the loss of her infant son Frederick, Roxane dedicated her professional life to volunteering, developing Freddy Match, an algorithm-driven website to match volunteers with those in need. Roxane builds supportive communities to expand the reach of volunteering. Roxane, welcome.
Hello, David. It's fantastic to be here.
Okay, well, let's get straight into it. And I'm wondering whether we can hear a bit more about your interest and experience within health settings and with volunteering.
Yeah, absolutely. So I definitely have a passion for getting people into volunteering, whatever their interest area. And I think that healthcare settings are particularly interesting because there's a great need in the sector for more volunteers. And there are some fantastic ways that people can contribute that I don't think you necessarily find outside this sector. So it's great to match people's skills with roles, and also thinking about volunteers as being on a journey, I suppose. You think that they may come into volunteering for all sorts of different reasons at different life stages. And again, healthcare is one of those areas where you can really allow them to explore those different options. So it may be that they just have an interest in healthcare, that they want to work in healthcare, or that they've retired and they've been exposed to or had their own personal experience of the healthcare settings, or a loved one who has been in healthcare. And all those different reasons give rise to this desire to give back to that sector. And it's just about then how they fit in and how they can be sort of inspired to find that role that's a great match.
Roxane, you recently spent some time in the UK and spoke with organisations about trends in volunteering in health settings. I'm wondering whether you can share some of your insights.
Yeah, I'd love to. I had a very interesting trip to the UK and I was fortunate enough to meet with a whole sort of different range of people whilst I was over there. I spoke to a number of people who work in various roles in the NHS, some people who worked for hospitals and other people who worked for, the wraparound support agencies that help people at various points in that healthcare life cycle. And what we were specifically talking about was, similarly to in Australia, during COVID, there was a big push to attract volunteers to help in various ways. I believe up in Queensland it was called the Care Army, and I understand there were similar programs all over the place. And through those programs, a lot of people were drawn to volunteering, and it was the same in the UK. They had the NHS first responders. A lot of people were drawn into volunteering, and in fact, more potential volunteers than there were at the time roles. And in the UK, the NHS immediately saw value in how those volunteers could be placed, not just during COVID, but also on the other side of it. And it sort of led this almost, I would say, like a revolution in the way volunteers were incorporated into the NHS and into the system. And there began this sort of effort to better use volunteers to improve patient outcomes, ultimately. So that might be reducing the time it takes to discharge somebody from hospital, or it might be diverting people from needing to use the ambulance service in the first place by community intervention. And then on the other sort of side, upon, discharge from hospital and going back home, how people could be better supported in the community. And what I found just fascinating was the breadth of programs that are now in place in the UK to support people at different points in that, I'm just going to say life cycle of the healthcare system. It was really interesting for me. I think I took sort of 4 things away from it. I would say how innovative the whole idea was to a system that's been around for a huge number of years, that to just take that view of how important volunteering is and really start to bring through the benefits of volunteering to not only the people in care, but also the people who are working so hard in healthcare, the doctors, the nurses, all the support staff, and enabling, as I said, improved patient outcomes, but also relieving some pressure off the system, particularly at such a challenging time for the healthcare system. So there was that side of it. So I'd say that efficiency gain. Then there was also this, remarkable innovation to do this. And on top of that, there was then this development of really, really appealing roles for people. So it wasn't just you come in and you talk to a patient or, something like that. It was all sorts of different specific roles. You could be a hydration volunteer. So you're going into the wards and, you're making people cocktails in inverted commas of, like water and lemon and encouraging them to stay hydrated because, of course, that improves your outcomes, or sitting with a person while they're eating. And then if you weren't really, looking for a patient-facing role, you could be doing things like a runner in the hospital. So there'd be a whole list of ways or things that needed to happen to expedite a patient's discharge. It might be they needed a wheelchair or they needed their medication collected from the pharmacy, whatever it might be. And you could turn up in the morning on the day. You'd be presented with a whole list of things that needed to happen to get 10 people discharged. And you could set about running around doing all those tasks. And apparently some people joined up those sorts of programs because, to get their step count up. And it's just one of those opportunities to feel really useful and just be, because you're providing this service that without which it would be hard for that patient to go home. So there were all these really sort of funny little examples within hospitals. And then I guess on either side, the pre-hospital journey, there's some fantastic work going on about how when somebody falls in their home, how you can, if you can get them up off the floor faster, you reduce their kind of long-term reliance on the healthcare system. So it's looking at programs about embedding people in the community who are trained in lifting, safe lifting. They can obviously understand when somebody needs urgent medical attention, but it's part of just, helping people to get back up on their feet and resume hopefully their normal daily life without in the UK there's sometimes, if it's a non-urgent call, somebody could be on the floor for maybe 12 hours. And I know that there's similar problems here with ambulance, the availability of ambulances. So it's just about how can you get that person up quicker and improve their long-term outcome. So I found that incredibly interesting. And then I suppose at the other end, upon discharge or, even at the point of diagnosis of certain things, particularly in the aged care setting, there's some very, again, innovative work going on about improving sort of the journey of a dementia patient, so they don't just necessarily get diagnosed as having dementia and then see a cognitive decline. There are programs coming in where you can go to a day centre for 28 weeks and go through a program where it's maintaining your cognitive function. And this is a service provided out in the community. But again, all these different roles, I just thought all these opportunities to volunteer. And I have this belief that there's something for everybody in the volunteering world, and it's just these ways that people can contribute and feel really useful and then feel empowered to maybe do more or go into different things. And like I said at the beginning, people may be looking at this for different reasons, and they may be, wanting to go into a career, as I said, or it's something to do, they've retired but whatever it might be, just it's those opportunities to contribute. So that appeal of the roles I found really interesting. And I think that the main way that this was sort of like a self-fulfilling prophecy was that the impact of what these volunteers were doing was really clear. It was all about come in and do this role and you will reduce discharge times. Or come in and, help this person up off the floor, you will improve their long-term outcomes. I mean, and that really clear impact measurement, I think is very, very important for just building that narrative about why volunteering is so, so important. So, yeah, long answer to a short question.
Roxane, it sounds like there are some amazing, innovative volunteer roles in the UK health system. One of the things that we've been saying for a while is for volunteer coordinators to consider creating roles outside of the norm. Though there are 3 big areas in CHSP: meals, transport and social support. But there's so much potential to expand those horizons. And of course, all of this is relevant to advertising volunteer roles, especially if you're able to connect a role with its direct impact. So before advertising, you need a great role to advertise. Roxane, how does Freddy Match fit into this picture? How did it come about and what is it?
So Freddy Match is designed to connect volunteers with roles that align with their skills and interests. And it plays that matchmaking function where we're trying to get the best people to both see and then apply for a role volunteering with an organisation. So if a volunteer creates an account on Freddy Match, they get recommended roles that align with what they're interested in, what their skills are, and then hopefully it's a match made in heaven and off they go and have a great volunteering journey. But to your point about having a great volunteer role, it's very interesting for us to observe what roles are particularly popular on Freddy Match and which need a little bit more help or a little bit more time to find volunteers. And I think that one of the most important things, and I just want to say this up front, is that most organisations have a service delivery role to fulfil. So you need to get people from A to B. You need them to be fed and you need those social support roles. And I don't think that's ever going to change. But there's great opportunity for a volunteer who is perhaps on the fence about committing in the long term to one of those roles. They might not have the availability. It might not initially be appealing to fulfill that role. And I say initially deliberately. But by providing them with other options to engage with your organisation and, your clients or your service recipients, you can give them that gateway into becoming more confident and perhaps, becoming more confident in their skills and their ability to fulfill one of those roles that are, I would say more demanding, particularly on the social support side, but also allowing them to understand perhaps how they could free up the time to maybe work in one of those slightly more regular or long-term commitment-based roles. And I think that that's really, really important. It sort of starts from that very first interaction with the organisation. What you want somebody to do is read a role description and think, oh, that sounds interesting. I think I could probably do that. And let me go off and read a bit more about this organisation and see what else they do. And Freddy Match provides that gateway. That's what we intend to do. We intend to pique someone's interest and then allow them to find all the information that they need to make the decision to go on and apply for a role. I guess that's what we are. We're like a warm handshake, right, between the two parties. And I just think that setting up the appealing roles is a very difficult proposition when you just haven't really thought in that space before. And we do appreciate that, and that's why we do offer support and guidance about how you can go about introducing more and varied roles to your organisation. And we can also connect you with other organisations that have done it successfully and are prepared to share some of those learnings, which is really important. As a sector, as a charity sector, we need to work together because there's a lot of competition for funds and volunteers and all sorts, but there's also a lot of learnings that organisations have made, and sharing those learnings, particularly in a volunteering context, is really, really important.
So, Roxane, given all of what you've spoken about so far, what messages would you have for organisations looking to recruit volunteers?
Good question, David. I think, first of all, my number one tip is to be patient. It's not magic. It doesn't happen overnight for you to find the right volunteer or volunteers. Just take some time and be prepared that it's the start of a relationship between the two parties. And I think that this is one of those parts of volunteer recruitment that often is overlooked. You are not recruiting a member of staff. You are not going to pay this person. They are going to be part of your team and a very important part of your team in many, many cases. The relationship has to start with what are they willing and able to offer you, and what are they looking for in return from you, and what are you prepared to give them. And I know that that sounds very much like you just need somebody to come in and serve a meal, right? But it has to be about more than that if you want that person to really commit to your organisation and come along with you for the journey. And I know that many people in the charity sector, myself included, you often start an organisation or you start out on this mission and you want everybody to share this passion that you have for what you're doing. In the early days, people often turn up who do just naturally share your passion and want to, change the way things are done or whatever it might be. But as you go on along the journey, you sometimes have to convince people a bit more about why what you're doing is so important. And it comes back to that impact thing. Remind them of the impact that they can make by doing this role with you. Not just that, why do you value that contribution so much? I think it comes back to ultimately you're asking for this person's help, right? They're not being paid. They've got to usually turn up fairly regularly. You want them to be reliable. You want them to be committed. So give them a reason to be committed. I know that sounds a bit wishy-washy, but I don't want to just say, stick an advert on Freddy Match and the volunteers will roll in, because I really think that unless you sell to them why you want them, why you need them, and what they could do for you, and you listen to what they want to give, unless you do that, you'll struggle to find those fantastic volunteers who stick around for you.
Thanks for that, Roxane. Volunteering has changed so much over the past few years, and obviously it's still evolving, and organisations are realising they need to be much more flexible in their approach and in the volunteer roles. What do you think prospective volunteers are looking for? What motivates them?
So that's really interesting, because motivations vary so much, and you do still have the traditional volunteers who get to a point in their life, something may have happened, just might be the time, might be the opportunity for them, whatever it is, whatever that initial kind of trigger is for getting involved in volunteering, and they just want to help. And those are the volunteers that will knock on your door and want to be volunteering with you. And then there's a whole sort of other pool of potential volunteers who we have to access, right? We have to engage in a different way. And I think it's back to what I said in my previous answer, which was about how do you appeal to these volunteers? How do you begin that relationship? Part of that, as you say, is flexibility. That sort of comes into the design of the role, right? So flexibility, and this is, again, back to that service delivery point. You have an obligation to fulfill. You have to get a meal to somebody on a Tuesday. That has to happen. And you need a volunteer to do that. So there's not much wiggle room in that, right? You need that job to be done. That in itself obviously leads to an inflexible kind of role environment, but it doesn't have to be inflexible, because then you can start to think about what are all the other levers that you can pull around that. you might be able to say, okay, we really need somebody on a Tuesday. Okay, you're not available on a Tuesday. Perhaps you could do another day. I understand you can only do fortnightly. It's about having a discussion. This person is interested in the role. They want to contribute to your organisation. Can you pull some levers so that they can contribute in a more flexible way? And if you can't, you can't. But perhaps then there's another opportunity with your organisation. And then in 5 months' time, they might be able to do that Tuesday meal delivery. But I think it's often flexibility is not just about, can I alter this role to suit this person? It's about, okay, this role isn't necessarily suitable for this person at this time, but they're keen to contribute to my organisation. So what flexibility do I have to create a new role that they can participate in? That is a great type of flexibility, because ultimately it can help you. It can make that volunteer think, oh, this organisation really wants me. I would like to help. And you're starting to build that relationship. So think about flexibility as, where can you provide flexibility, rather than it has to be, totally on a volunteer's terms, because, we all know in volunteer involving organisations that's just not actually reasonable, as if you have an obligation to fulfil to your service recipients. So I think that type of flexibility is important, if that sort of makes sense. And then from a what motivates volunteers point of view, like I said, you've got this ready, engaged group of volunteers who don't require that much motivation, but there is this separate cohort of volunteers that have to be persuaded that volunteering is how they want to spend their time, and not doing some other activity, whatever it might be, to the point of the volunteering landscape has changed. People have just got many more things contributing or vying for their attention, right? And it's about cutting through that noise. And again, it's the appeal of the role, why it's so important they contribute, and not guilt-tripping people into volunteering. I don't believe in that. But I do believe in really making the case for why it's important. And, you as an organisation are best placed to do that, because you know the value it brings. Yeah, not being afraid to tell that story and using that as a strong motivator. And ultimately, you'll either motivate somebody or you won't. And if you don't motivate them, then perhaps they're not the right person.
Fantastic. Thank you, Roxane. Okay, now I'm going to put you on the spot here. After everything we've chatted about, I want you to crystallise those ideas into your top 5 tips for organisations.
So first of all, be aware that there are a lot of channels out there for you to advertise on, and some will be more effective for your particular organisation than others. Up front, give some thought to where you're going to advertise for volunteers. And that might be word of mouth, it might be flyers, it might be print media, it might be digital, but just give some thought to those recruitment channels and make sure you have a process for dealing with inquiries from all of those different channels, because that first touch point from a volunteer where they apply, whatever your channel might be, that's their first experience with you, and you want that to be a good one. So you want to be organised and ready to accept those inquiries. So that's number one. Number 2 is that design of the roles piece. So creating appealing roles. I think, as we've both talked about, if you need assistance crafting those appealing roles, I'm very happy to help. And I'm sure that David is equally happy to help. But yeah, trying to craft appealing roles is again, a very important one. The third one is, I think, probably a little bit left field, which is, how can you innovate? How can you think about your service in a slightly different way to provide flexibility when volunteers are coming through? So just about what can you do to get those interested parties doing something useful for your organisation that's valuable to them. So, and I use the word innovate there. I know it's a bit of an overused word, but yeah, you often do have to be a bit innovative or creative maybe in your thinking to provide that flexibility. Again, that's something I'd be very happy to talk more about or help with if I can. And then the next one is a boring one, but efficiency. So right from the get-go, like I said about the recruitment channels, just building efficiency into your recruitment processes, keeping people up to date with where their application's at, really communicating with the volunteers, and just giving them that good experience. Because whatever the outcome, if they're not quite the right volunteer for you, then they may have a friend who they refer to you later on. So just really respecting people's time. And, the best way to do that is by having a nice, efficient process to get volunteers through. And then my final one is impact. And I know, again, this is a massively overused word, but simply put, what do volunteers do for you and what is the effect of that? And if the effect or the ultimate impact is you serve a meal to someone, right? And that person then has some social interaction to look forward to every day. Think about how you package that up into something fairly, hard-hitting in terms of an outcome. So that is reducing social isolation and loneliness, but using that phrase might not be particularly appealing to a volunteer. So instead, think about it as serving this meal to this person on this day. This provides somebody with a connection that they wouldn't have without your help, right? And just putting that impact back to the actual volunteer, not, necessarily the way that we think about impact or outcomes when we're doing reporting or something. Just how is that volunteer making an impact? Yeah, so that's 5. Appeal, efficiency, innovation, impact, and the first one was solid recruitment process.
That is great, Roxane. Thank you so much. There you go. There's your top 5 tips for recruiting and advertising. Roxane, we're nearly out of time. It's been great speaking with you and so insightful. Let's talk a little bit more about Freddy Match. How can organisations advertise on Freddy Match, firstly, if they're CHSP-funded organisations or if they're organisations with a different service focusing on serving other people in the community?
So it's nice and easy. You just go to freddymatch.org and hit the big button that says Find Volunteers. And then you can go through a sign-up process, which is fairly straightforward, and begin listing opportunities to volunteer immediately. If you're a CHSP-funded organisation based in South Australia, then you can go through the same process and indicate in that sign-up process that you're CHSP-funded, and we'll put you in touch with Volunteering South Australia and Northern Territories, who can help with the role follow-up and how you advertise opportunities and get yourself part of the community here. And as always, if you have any questions or queries, we either have an online form that you can fill in, or you can give us a call to our help desk and we'll get you sorted out and up and running to find volunteers, especially during this busy time of year for everybody.
Thank you, Roxane. Thanks for sharing your thoughts and experience with us today. We're so pleased to be collaborating with you and Freddy Match to support CHSP-funded organisations.
Thanks so much for inviting me on the podcast, David. I've had a great time. And as you say, I'm very happy to be contacted and help out in any way I can.
Pleasure, Roxane. Thank you for being with us today. And by the way, if you're looking for the link to the Freddy Match website, you'll find it in the description notes for this podcast. And if your organisation is CHSP funded and you would like more information, please contact Roxane or myself for further information. Well, that's all for today. Join us again in 2024 for the next podcast in our series, and we look forward to working with you again. Have an enjoyable and relaxing festive season and safe travels if you're heading away for the holidays. Bye for now.